Welcome to CannaClinical, and today I'm going to be talking about Steven Crowder's mini-documentary on marijuana. So he starts out with this segment asking presumably college kids, or more generally young people, what they think about cannabis. My first impression is that this is an example of discrediting low-hanging fruit to wreck the libs on pot, but let's see what he has to say.
So I'm here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, one of the first cities to actually decriminalize the drug, and home to a few more than enthusiastic supporters.
Free the weed!
In order to get to the bottom of the issue. Marijuana, should it be legalized?
Yeah.
Good thing.
I definitely think that it should be legal.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Government's cracking down on unhealthy snacks and vending machines. Big gulps banned in New York. I'm sure you've heard of this. Good idea, bad idea?
I think that it's a good idea.
I don't want to say some people have reached the point where maybe they shouldn't make their own decisions, but I think that's what it's becoming.
I think it's kind of good, because then, it's better for everyone's health.
Think marijuana should be legalized?
Yeah. I mean, you can do whatever you want to your own body.
Except the big gulp.
Touche.
This banned, this legal.
Now here's my answer to that question. Yes, I think it should be legalized, but same aversion to the big gulp ban that you have, I have towards marijuana. Recreational legalization of cannabis is much like that of alcohol in the 1930s, in that for me it's an issue of freedom. Just as you are free to drink your whiskey and smoke your cigars on your show and accept the risk that it may pose to your health, we should be free to indulge in cannabis as well. Cannabis has not always been illegal, and in fact it really wasn't for most of American history. Its fibrous components have been used for anything from building materials to the fenders on cars, to the first American flags, drafts to major founding papers, food, fuel, and clothes. Its concentrates have been used for recreational, medicinal, and spiritual purposes for a very long time as well around the world. The prohibition of cannabis is unique in that it was largely media misinformation, racist associations to criminality, think reefer madness, that instilled enough fear into the public that it led to a social rejection of cannabis on the state level and then later the federal level for reasons independent of the danger that it actually does and the literature that we actually have as to the medical efficacy of the drug. The current iteration of federal drug policy has only been in place since 1970, and there are a number of contradictions in their enforcement model with other drugs too. So let's not pretend as if evidence-based control is how the feds have regulated pot or any number of Schedule I drugs, including psychedelics and even heroin, which is indicated for medical use in other major industrialized countries like the UK. And as time goes on, there continues to be less and less justification to maintain the current scheduling for cannabis as Schedule I.
Does not have the authority to make drugs illegal regardless of how harmless they may be, and that's a fully legitimate discussion to have. However, among everybody that we asked, everyone thought that marijuana should be legal, and not one made a constitutional argument. They all actually said
It's way less harmful than a lot of things, such as alcohol.
I think it's just another drug like alcohol.
It's not really harming anyone. It doesn't really cause harm in most people's life, and certainly less harm than alcohol.
So considering that this is the premise under which the discussion of marijuana legalization is now being discussed, it's important to find out if it's true.
Now this is an interesting tactic in framing, and one that you frequently see with people arguing against legalization on the basis of cannabis's danger. The people who say that it's harmless are often conflated with the entirety of public opinion on the side of legalization. These kids, these high school kids, no credentials, don't go to doctors who could speak intelligently on the topic, like you'll see him do to justify his argument on cannabis's danger. Just frame the argument as the kids say it, so this is the predominant position of the intellectual legalization advocates. And in reality, while the it's harmless trope is a serious problem because it's not based in facts, the tactic used here at its core is a straw man argument, because instead of arguing the constitutional basis of legalization, the freedom aspect, which you said yourself was a good argument, and whether federal authorities should have the authority to regulate it, or whether you should leave that to states or local governments or whatever, you can just, instead of that, you can just trample on this dead horse of an argument that basically no one intelligent will say. Because if you were to shine a light on what the more intelligent and moderate voices on that side of the argument would say, you probably would get more of the opinion of, just like any other drug, there are certain uses for it, and if you use it improperly and in excess, you can develop an unhealthy relationship with it or put yourself in danger in some way or another. But this is a much harder point to trample over. It's much more nuanced and it's much less sexy and sensational. I agree with him that cannabis is dangerous if you use it improperly, but like alcohol, it is possible to use it in moderation, and it is dangerous if you use it improperly and in inappropriate circumstances. It's not something that you'll just immediately see everyone injecting into their eye sockets in a year or two. It's something that people have been using for decades, and not something that everybody just starts ramping up their use as soon as it becomes legal. The statistics do not support that. There are a lot of people that are not willing to come out and public with their use of cannabis due to the repercussions that it could have on their career, on their lives, on their religious, communities and things, by being associated with an illegal drug that is condemned across certain subsets of the population. And I think, honestly, the danger aspect of the argument is, much like the it's harmless wing of the argument, is over-sensationalized, and that it relies on predictions of how usage and addiction rates and things will manifest with little attention paid to what actually has happened, and looking at the actual usage statistics as time goes on when you actually, just try it and legalize it and see what happens. So since this is a years old video, this was made in 2012, and he wouldn't have access to the statistics that I'm going to bring up in this video, allow me to shed some light on what has actually happened to usage rates nationally since the video was made, and since the country has been undergoing this massive exodus from state-level prohibition.
So we sat down with Dr. Phyllis Boniface, a doctor who specializes in psychiatric care and, more importantly, the possible effects of marijuana.
It's actually very damaging. And to compare it with alcohol, just to give you a basis for comparison, humans are designed to metabolize alcohol in the liver at a certain rate per hour. The brain is largely fat, and this drug is stored in fat. And so what happens is, after the intoxication is long over, we have a drug that's hanging around exerting an effect on your nervous system for weeks to months. People who smoke at a young age have a much higher incidence of psychosis and psychotic disorders. We think that there's a gene that predisposes people to schizophrenia, for example. And when people are exposed to marijuana, they have an onset of their illness about 3 years before we normally would see it. And their psychosis is much worse.
Wrong. Cannabis does not take months to stop exerting potentially impairing effects on your brain. In fact, the duration that it'll stay in your system depends on a variety of factors, including frequency of use and body fat content and individual metabolic factors. While it is true that it'll store in your fat, does it get released in large enough levels to cause impairment or intoxication? Probably not. In fact, we do not have a scientific way of knowing how much in your blood constitutes intoxication or impairment, since it lingers so long. And actually, your blood levels and tissue levels of cannabis often depends on, again, how frequently you smoke it, which means that if you smoke very frequently, you will have much more in your system at any given point in time, regardless of any impairment. So we actually don't have much of an ability to even correlate how much is in your blood or tissues with current levels of impairment, or whether it's exerting any effects. I would be interested in what research she's pointing to in making that claim, because I sure can't find it. And I get that she's talking about cannabis in particular here, but I wonder why, if she's going to compare alcohol to tobacco in this discussion, give us a basis for comparison, why not talk about how alcohol is used among adolescents at far higher rates and similarly causes impairments in development? How about how alcohol can also induce psychosis due to consumption or withdrawal? Is it common? No. But is it common among cannabis users? No. A 2002 longitudinal study on cannabis consumption and schizophrenia risk, whose results have been confirmed by later longitudinal analyses, found that 13% of cases of schizophrenia could be avoided if cannabis use was not reported. That's one of their findings. But this is also using self-report data and assumes a causal relationship. But let's just toss aside if we can assume causality from this study for a second. Let's assume they're right, and let's calculate the real-world consequences of this result in how common schizophrenia actually is in society, and how much cannabis increases the incidence of schizophrenia and psychotic symptoms using their conclusions. How common is schizophrenia? Well, schizophrenia, according to this study, linked in the description, has a median incidence of 0.015% of the population, or 15 and change out of every 100,000 people. This means that if 13% of cases could be avoided, this amounts to around 2 people out of every 100,000 people, or 0.002% more of the population will present schizophrenia, and the conditions of the study even controlled for disparate psychiatric histories at baseline.
Now forgive me, my crazy old pothead speak is a little rusty, but allow me to try and translate for a second. The war on drugs waged by this government has been largely ineffective. In legalizing drugs here in the United States, I believe that we would reduce the failed war on drugs, decrease crime, and likely see a result of less overall use, as in countries abroad who have followed such a policy. There's this idea that legalizing marijuana would free up a ton of space in our penitentiaries, but It's just not true. I have the numbers here in front of me, okay? Less than 0.1% of state prisoners were marijuana possession offenders with no prior sentences. Let's take that a step further. Only 1.4% of state prisoners were drug offenders held for crimes only involving marijuana. You said you did time in a federal penitentiary for nothing more than marijuana possession.
Attempted distribution.
Attempted distribution, what's that exactly?
Well, that means I was trying to sell it. When I sold marijuana to my friends and my customers, I was providing a community service.
Any prior infractions?
DUIs.
Okay, a few things. Firstly, here in the United States, where marijuana has either been decriminalized or legalized, its usage tends to increase, more than some of you may know. We went to community high school here in Ann Arbor to ask teenagers about their experiences with marijuana. The results were shocking. Have you ever smoked marijuana?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I have.
Yep.
Yes.
So your mom knows?
Now she does.
I've been doing it probably 3 years now.
15, been smoking for 3 years. You know what I was doing at 12? Playing Pogs. Out of all the students we'd interviewed, only 2 had not smoked marijuana. Their biggest reason for trying it? Surprise!
It's harmless.
There's no bad side effects.
I don't think it can be necessarily harmful.
It's not like a bad drug.
It's a plant. It's,
Well, you mean it's natural?
yeah.
So's uranium.
Well,
After all, it's got nothing on a 16-ounce Mr. Pibb, but funnily enough, the perception of marijuana being harmless, as largely pushed by today's marijuana lobby, has statistically resulted in increased use among teenagers.
We know that it affects myelinization, and myelinization is what determines the maturity and the development of the brain. People don't know it, but your brain is actually developing into your early to mid-20s. When we're altering the myelinization, we're actually altering the way your brain will function for the rest of your life.
That being said, the kids do seem to think that it might be more prevalent here than nationally because...
In Ann Arbor, yes, I guess. Everybody seems to have some.
Shocker! Despite what people say, the more lenient the drug laws, the more likely people, including kids, are to light up.
So in order to prove that cannabis use increases after legalization, you defer to high school kids. Are you serious? You pick out a few, and even if a lot of them say that they've smoked, it doesn't matter. Your scientific way of proving that this is true is picking out a few high school kids to speak for the increased usage rates when it's made legal. I get that there weren't a lot of statistics at that time for what happens when you make a state recreationally legal, because there were none yet, or medicinally legal over the long term, but we have that now. I mean, since Stephen here won't use statistics, allow me. Here's the last 15 years, extending all the way back to 2002, way back to 10 years before this video was even made. These statistics were actually available back then, by the way, but they just didn't extend to 2017, obviously. Notice anything? Are you seeing increases that are more than we may think in adolescents, or even the general public at large? The largest increase in ages 18 to 25, which far and away exceeds the proportion of any other age group who uses it at that frequency, across this time span, has increased a whopping 5%. Over 12 to 17 aged individuals, it has declined 1.7%. 12 and over, which is basically everybody, including adolescents, has increased 3.3%, and 26 and older up 3.9%. Even among the population that you are asking, which fall into the 12 to 17 age group, we have seen a decline, not an increase. Stats, Stephen, stats. Stop trying to mislead us with fear tactics like, if you legalize it, the kids will use it more. This is not true, and it was plainly evident even at the time that this video was made, yet you ignored it. And even if you take into account what he did have at the time using this survey, 12 to 17 was down 1%, not increased, while 18 to 25 was up 1.4, 26 and older was up 1.3, and 12 and older was up 1.1%. Is this not worth mentioning, Stephen? We're seeing since the early 2000s to 2012 like a % increase across age groups, and since an additional like maybe 2 to 3%. And in kids, a decline of 1% or more now. Kids are using it at least once a month less than in the early 2000s, not more, when there were far fewer medicinal states and no recreational states, while adults are using it once a month like between 3 and 5% more. This is actually kind of to be expected as far as I'm concerned, a slight increase in how many people report using cannabis, which in part, I imagine, could be attributed to a shift from stigmatization, people being afraid to report using it, to now being okay with admitting it because it's legal to buy, use, and less socially stigmatized. But even still, these are not wide fluctuations. And this is a good thing. I mean, if you want to incentivize the rebel culture around cannabis by keeping it illegal, which encourages kids to use it because it makes them cool and shit, go ahead. But me, I'd rather not have any part in that. I also think that it's kind of funny that you point at this statistic. The second highest incidence of adolescent marijuana smoking has no medical marijuana law, and neither does the 5th and the 7th entry. And this is also lifetime use, so this is anywhere from have you ever to I inject it into my eye sockets on the daily. And even then, 3 of the top 10 and 2 of the top 5 have no medical marijuana laws. So while it may be true that kids are more likely to smoke in states that have medical marijuana laws, what is the larger trend through this whole legalization movement? That's where it all comes back to, and he keeps dancing around that question. And I've already beaten this point to death, but adolescent use is not trending upwards since the early 2000s. It peaked in the early 2000s, and then again in like 2011, but has been fluctuating within like 1% or so, and has declined if you compare 2002 to now, after 28 states have legalized medicinal, and like 9 states plus DC have legalized recreational cannabis.
So, if we legalize drugs, would that really be better for today's law-abiding citizens?
The myth that nobody's ever died from a THC-related accident is just not true. And the reason people believe that it hasn't happened is because it's a tougher process to go through to test for it.
You smell something, Rabbit?
Fear. I can take your blood alcohol level just by a breath test.
You fellas been doing a bit of boozing, have you? Sucking back on Grandpa's old cough medicine?
It's not a Miranda right or anything like that. It's just based on your driver's license. Where if I want to get your THC level, I have to get a warrant to take blood from you or urine.
You're crazy!
Do I want to have it legal for me to do? Well, then the police have to have more rights to be able to check you for it. And where do people fall on that line?
And as a matter of fact, there is some data to suggest that legalization actually increases crime, as seen here from the LAPD DEA. Now, the reason the numbers might be different from the crime increase during the Prohibition era is because of one key difference. During Prohibition, the American government decided to suddenly ban an activity in which a vast majority of Americans engaged. In legalizing drugs, you'd be doing the exact opposite. You would now be allowing and in some ways encouraging a practice in which currently only a minority of Americans engage. Listen, at the end of the day, I can understand somebody saying, okay, marijuana is harmful. Legalizing it will likely result in increased usage and have possibly some negative societal ramifications here in the United States. But the federal government does not have the authority, and it's been largely ineffective in waging the war on drugs. That's a completely legitimate argument, and there can be arguments made on both sides. What I have a problem with, however, is the discussion being based on a premise that is a lie. That is a huge disservice to our political discourse today, and more importantly, generations of the future.
Who in the hell says that no one has died from a THC-related accident ever? No one. That's who. Usually, the argument is that it's impossible to overdose and die on, which is a completely different argument, which it seems to be the case when people are able to take dabs of like 14 grams or something, like a half ounce, and live to try it again. I mean, if that won't kill you, then what in the hell will? I find it surprising, though, that Steven Crowder, a small government conservative, does not argue against the premise that the cop should have more authority to demand your body fluids, to degrade the evidentiary standard that currently exists to be able to test you for cannabis. Which, by the way, as I said earlier, its concentration in your blood and urine depends more on how frequently you smoke than it does whether you're high at the moment, because it takes so long to exit your body. Testing at the time of the accident or the stop is complicated by this fact. You can take saliva tests too, but all this really tells you is that it's in your blood to a certain degree of reliability. It does not indicate how much is in your blood or when you ingested last. And if you smoke, it may take 12 hours for it to get out of your saliva, and you reach peak plasma concentrations between like 3 to 10 minutes after inhalation, and the effects certainly don't last 12 hours through smoking. Does having it in your blood from prior use, regardless of whether you're intoxicated at the time, give them the ability to assume that at this current moment you're impaired? Like, it's just a big rabbit hole that I don't think it's a good idea to jump down, making it easier for the cops to compel you to give your blood or urine in exchange for legal cannabis. Also, I should note that your crime figures are not reflected in overall crime trends either in the state which your statistic was purportedly taken, nor across the country. Property crime and violent crime has been trending downward in the U.S. fairly drastically since the late 80s, early 90s, and has continued this trend through the legalization effort, with no significant spikes along the way. It's easy to take one narrow statistic from one agency for very narrow criteria of the kinds of crime that they're analyzing and make broad statements. But no, Stephen, the overall trend as the country has been swept with legal marijuana, and across California too, is a decrease in crime overall, property and violent. Property crime in California since 1996, when it legalized medical, has gone from around 4,000 per 100,000 to 3,000 per 100,000, which is a reduction of around 25%, while violent crime has gone from around 750 to 500 per 100,000, a reduction of around 33%. Is this due to marijuana? I don't know, because nationally it's been trending this way since, again, like the 80s or 90s. I don't know how they came to that statistic given the overall crime trends in California, to be totally honest with you, but I'm sourcing the Public Policy Institute of California and the FBI for the national level statistic. Going forward, I think it would be useful to start trying to refute the more powerful arguments for legalization, like the argument to federal authority to regulate cannabis on the state and local level, or the relative effectiveness of the drug war, in your opinion. It's easy and it makes for good clickbait to talk about the idiots who think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with it under any circumstances, but if you really want to contribute to the discourse in a meaningful way, stop being like they are. Stop lying. Look at the statistics and form an opinion based on the information that you have and that is in front of you, rather than try to find information to fit your narrative and ignore everything else, just as you accuse those people of doing. Anyways, that's about all I have for you guys today. Comment down below whether you believe that Stephen's criticisms were off base or if you think I'm being overly critical. Either way, let's keep the discussion going down below. Drop a like on the video if you like this kind of content, and subscribe and hit the notification bell to be alerted for any new videos. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay meducated.